Daniel lived in a quiet little town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and where the old clock tower still chimed at noon. He ran a small watch repair shop that his father had passed down to him. It wasn't much, just a single room with a counter, a few dusty shelves, and the soft ticking of clocks that seemed to whisper the passing seconds of people's lives. Daniel was good. In fact, he was brilliant. He had an instinct for gears, springs, and timing. A gift, people said, just like his dad. But that phrase, just like his dad, haunted him. See, his father had been a local legend, the man who could fix anything that ticked. When he passed away, people didn't just look at Daniel as himself. They looked at him as his father's son, the one who had to keep the legacy alive, the one who had to make everyone proud. So Daniel did what so many of us do. He tried to prove himself. He worked long hours, said yes to every repair, smiled for every customer. But deep down, he felt hollow. He didn't love what he was doing anymore. He wasn't building a dream, he was maintaining an image. Every time he failed at something, every time a watch came back because it wasn't perfect, he didn't just feel like he'd made a mistake. He felt like he'd let everyone down. And that's when he started chasing motivation. He began sketching wild ideas, watches that could tell time through light, through sound, even through motion. He told himself, this one's going to change everything. He'd get that electric rush, that feeling of excitement that makes you believe this time will be different. But after a few days, when things got hard, when the work got slow, when nobody noticed what he was doing, that motivation faded. He'd put the project aside and start something new. And every time he quit, he told himself, maybe I'm just not good enough. Sound familiar? That's what living for others does. It makes your self-worth depend on applause. And when the applause stops, so do you. Weeks turned into months. Bills piled up. The shop grew quiet. And one night, Daniel sat at his workbench long after closing, staring at a broken pocket watch that wouldn't tick. He sighed, looked at the ceiling, and whispered, "Dad, what am I doing wrong?" He didn't get an answer, just the cold, heavy silence of a man who'd lost his spark. But that silence, that low point, was where his story truly began. A few mornings later, the sound of the bell above Daniel's shop door startled him. It had been days since anyone had come in. He looked up and saw an elderly man standing in the doorway, well-dressed, sharp eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses, carrying something wrapped carefully in a faded blue cloth. "Are you Daniel Cooper?" the man asked. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. The old man stepped closer and set the wrapped bundle on the counter. When Daniel unfolded the cloth, his heart skipped a beat. Inside was a magnificent, old-fashioned grandfather clock, small enough to fit on a table, but crafted with the kind of skill you rarely saw anymore. The polished oak frame was engraved with intricate vines, and at the base was a brass plate that read, "Samuel Whitmore, 1902. Daniel recognized the name. Samuel Whitmore had built clocks for presidents and museums. His work was legendary. "This clock," the man said quietly, "belonged to my father. It hasn't ticked in 50 years. I've taken it to specialists from Boston to Chicago. They all say the same thing. It's unfixable." He paused, studying Daniel's face. "Your father fixed my watch when I was a boy. People say you have his hands. If anyone can bring this back to life, it's you." Daniel's chest tightened. The man's words lit something inside him, that old spark of pride. This wasn't a battery replacement or a basic cleaning. This was history, a masterpiece, and fixing it would mean proving that he really was his father's son. He smiled, trying to hide his nerves. "I'll take a look at it," he said. "How long will it take?" the man asked. Daniel hesitated, then answered, "Give me 3 weeks." The man nodded. "If you can make it tick again, I'll make sure this shop never closes its doors." As the old man left, Daniel locked the door behind him and turned back to the clock. It was beautiful, but inside, it was chaos. He carefully removed the back panel, revealing a maze of gears, springs, levers, and screws. Thousands of tiny parts, each one depending on the others. One wrong move, and the whole mechanism could be ruined. But Daniel didn't care. This was his chance, his comeback story. For the next few days, he threw himself into the work. He woke up early, skipped lunch, stayed up past midnight. He took the clock apart piece by piece, labeling every gear, every pin, every bolt. The first few days were thrilling. The kind of rush that makes you forget to check your phone, forget the world outside. But by the fifth day, the excitement started to fade. The parts looked endless. His hands ached, his back hurt, and the clock still didn't tick. He cleaned every surface, adjusted every spring, polished every brass tooth. Still silent. His motivation, that bright, burning fire, began to flicker. He started questioning himself. What if I'm just like them? What if this clock really can't be fixed? What if I'm wasting my time? By the end of the second week, the shop was a mess. Trays of screws scattered across the counter, blueprints crumpled on the floor. Daniel sat in his chair, staring at the hundreds of disassembled parts, his reflection warped in a half-polished gear. And for the first time in years, he felt completely defeated. He pushed the stool away, got up, and muttered, "I'll call him tomorrow. I can't do this." He turned off the light and left the shop. Outside, the streets were quiet. Only the soft hum of street lights and the distant sound of a train. As he walked home, Daniel thought about all the things he'd started but never finished. The new clock design, the half-built prototype, the sketchbook filled with dreams collecting dust. Every one of them had begun the same way, with passion, and ended the same way, with frustration. He sighed. "I can't live like this," he said under his breath. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned, the image of the broken clock haunting him. Around midnight, he got up and walked to his study, the old desk that once belonged to his father. He opened the drawers, looking for something, maybe comfort, maybe guidance. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath a pile of old invoices, he found a small leather journal. The cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. On the first page, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "The measure of a craftsman." Daniel turned the page and began to read. The pages of the old leather journal smelled faintly of oil and time. Daniel turned them carefully, afraid they might crumble under his fingers. Each line was written in his father's small, steady handwriting. No poetry, no grand speeches, just the quiet record of a man who showed up for his work every day. Monday. Repaired Mrs. Thompson's mantel clock. Took longer than expected. Learned patience today. Tuesday. Cleaned the City Hall tower gears. Hands shaking by the end. Still, I'll finish tomorrow. Thursday. Failed to repair the Whitmore clock. Will try again next week. Page after page, it was all the same. No ego, no inspiration, no talk of genius. Just small notes, consistent effort, day after day. And then, near the end of the journal, Daniel found a paragraph written differently. Darker ink, firmer handwriting, as if his father had wanted those words to last forever. It read, "A man who works only when he feels inspired will live a life of many beginnings and no endings. The great clock does not tick because it is motivated. It ticks because it was built with precision and discipline. Do the work, even when you don't feel like it. One day, the sound of that steady ticking will be your reward." Daniel sat back in his chair, the words echoing in his mind. All this time, he had been chasing motivation, chasing approval, chasing moments of excitement. He had been living for the rush, not the result. But his father had lived for the work itself. It hit him hard. The truth that discipline isn't about feeling ready. It's about showing up anyway. Daniel realized something that night. His father wasn't great because he was special. He was great because he was consistent. And Daniel wanted that. He didn't want to live for applause anymore. He didn't want to chase sparks that burned out too soon. He wanted to build a fire that lasted. So he made a promise to himself right there in that dimly lit room. No more waiting for the perfect moment, no more quitting when things got hard. he would show up. Every single day. The next morning, Daniel walked into the shop before sunrise. The air was cool, and the first light was spilling through the front window. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't check his messages. He just walked straight to the workbench and looked at the mountain of tiny parts that had defeated him a day earlier. But this time, something was different. He didn't see failure. He saw a path, 1,000 little steps he just had to take one at a time. He picked up a small gear between his tweezers and whispered to himself, 4 hours. That's all I'm asking. 4 hours every day, no matter how I feel. And that's exactly what he did. The first few days were brutal. He'd spend hours cleaning a single spring or adjusting one stubborn pin. Some days, he made almost no progress. Some days, his hands cramped, his eyes burned, and his mind screamed, "This is pointless." But every time that thought came, he'd remember his father's words, "Do the work even when you don't feel like it." So he kept going. 4 hours a day, every day. He stopped chasing excitement. He stopped waiting for motivation to show up. Instead, he built momentum. One quiet, steady, deliberate movement at a time. And something began to change. At first, it was subtle. He started noticing small details he had missed before. A worn groove on a gear, a faint scratch on a spring that didn't align quite right. His hands grew steadier. His focus deepened. What once felt like torture began to feel like peace. The work wasn't boring anymore. It was grounding. It became his meditation. And then, one afternoon, 3 weeks into his new routine, Daniel found it, buried deep in the core of the clock, a gear so small it could rest on his fingertip, had a single bent tooth, a flaw so tiny that most people would never have noticed it. But it was enough to stop the entire mechanism from working. The whole clock, silent for 50 years, had been waiting for someone patient enough to find that one imperfection. Daniel smiled, shaking his head in disbelief. He didn't jump up or shout, he just felt a deep, quiet pride. Because this time, he hadn't found the answer in a burst of genius. He had found it through persistence. He carefully filed the tooth, cleaned it, and reassembled the gear. Then, piece by piece, he began putting the clock back together. Every gear clicked into place like a puzzle, finally solved. Hours later, he hung the pendulum, wound the spring, and stepped back. He took a deep breath and gave the pendulum a gentle push. For a moment, and then the sound came. Tick, tock, tick, tock. That steady rhythm filled the room like music. Daniel closed his eyes. That wasn't just the sound of a clock coming back to life. That was the sound of a man finally finding his own rhythm. The sound of discipline. He didn't need to post about it. He didn't need anyone's approval. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't care what anyone thought. He wasn't living for applause anymore. He was living for peace. He wiped his hands on a cloth, leaned back in his chair, and whispered, "I did it, Dad." The next morning, sunlight poured through the shop windows, bathing the counters in a warm golden glow. The little grandfather clock stood tall on the workbench, ticking proudly, steady and sure, as if it had never stopped. Daniel couldn't help but smile. He had fixed something that a dozen experts had called impossible. But deep down, he knew the real victory wasn't the clock, it was himself. He had rediscovered the quiet strength his father had lived by, not excitement, not genius. Discipline. Just before noon, the bell above the door rang again. The same elderly man stepped inside, hat in hand. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on the clock. For a moment, he didn't say a word. He just stood there staring, his lips trembling slightly. Then he walked closer, listening to the steady rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. "It's alive," he whispered. "I haven't heard that sound since I was a boy." He placed his hand gently on the polished oak frame, and for a brief second, his eyes glistened with tears. "You didn't just fix a clock," he said softly. "You gave me back a piece of my father." Daniel swallowed hard. "It wasn't easy," he said quietly, "but I realized something along the way. The hard part wasn't the clock. The hard part was me." The old man nodded slowly. "Most things worth doing are." After the man left, Daniel stood in the quiet shop, still hearing the echo of the ticking clock. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was a heartbeat. A reminder that progress doesn't come from waiting for the right feeling. It comes from showing up when it's hard. From doing the work no one applauds. From choosing consistency over chaos. Over the next few months, things began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. Word spread that Daniel Cooper had repaired the unfixable clock. Customers started returning, not because of a viral video, not because of a clever ad, but because they could sense something different in him. He wasn't rushing to impress anymore. He wasn't working for likes or recognition. He was working with purpose. And that purpose started spilling into everything he did. He trained a young apprentice from the high school. He rebuilt the old clock tower that had been silent for years. And every evening, he would sit by the window of his shop, listening to the ticking of dozens of clocks, each one a little symphony of persistence. One night, while closing up, Daniel looked around and realized something. Every clock in that room, big or small, simple or grand, only worked because of one thing, a rhythm. Not speed, not flash, just rhythm, steady, patient, relentless rhythm. And then he smiled, because that was him now. He had found his rhythm too. He picked up his father's journal from the shelf and added one final line at the bottom of the last page. I finally understand. The measure of a man isn't what he starts, it's what he finishes. And now, maybe you, yes, you, listening to this story, need to hear that too. Maybe you've been chasing applause. Maybe you've been building dreams based on what others think you should do. Maybe you've been waiting for motivation to strike again before you take your next step. But let me tell you something Daniel learned the hard way. Motivation is a spark. It gets you started. But discipline is the engine that keeps you going when that spark dies out. You can't build a life on excitement. You build it on effort. You build it on showing up, especially on the days you don't want to. Because that's where growth lives. Not in the bursts of energy, but in the boring, quiet, consistent work that no one sees. Stop living for others. Stop waiting for someone to clap for you before you start moving. Your worth isn't in the validation you get, it's in the value you give. When you work with discipline, you don't just change your results, you change yourself. You become the kind of person who finishes what they start, who builds something lasting, who stands tall even when no one's watching. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Don't chase motivation. Build discipline. Don't live for applause. Live for purpose. Don't wait for permission. Just start and keep going. Because one day you'll look back and realize the ticking sound of your life, those steady, relentless steps you took, became your greatest music. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs this message today.